So I spent the last few days wandering around Krakow, and now I've come to my natural homeland, the mountains. This is the Tatras Mountains, a place called Zakopane. And so I've been able to observe the Polish culture. And let me just say this first. I'm not suggesting in any way that the Polish culture is superior to the English. You know, I'm a true Englishman and I always will be. But something struck me. Poland knows exactly what it is. You know, whereas us in Britain, we'd spend most of our time arguing about what it was. You know, how did that happen? Because if you walk around the streets of Krakow or just spend any time around Polish people, you feel something that's becoming increasingly rare around the rest of Western Europe, you know, even the world. A people who know their story, you know, not because they believe they're perfect, but because they remember what they've endured, what they've survived. You know, Poland has been partitioned, occupied, invaded, you know, people and literally the country wiped from the map. You know, millions of its people died during the Second World War. Cities were destroyed. Its identity was attacked. Its language suppressed. Its faith persecuted. For centuries, and even during the Cold War, people weren't simply defending Polish territory. They were defending the idea of Poland itself. And that changes a people. It teaches every generation that freedom is not permanent. It has to be defended at all costs. One of the greatest moments in Polish history came in 1683. The Ottoman Empire, the Islamic hordes, they stood at the outside of the gates of Vienna. And if Vienna fell, the balance of power in Europe could have changed dramatically. But it was a Polish king who led the Allied cavalry charge in one of history's most famous and most significant charges. The winged hussars, you know, broke the Ottoman lines. And if you ever get a chance to look at their husbandry on the horses, it's just incredible. It would have been an incredible sight to behold. And they lifted the siege. And from that, Europe was saved from what many feared would have been a further Ottoman and Islamic expansion into Central Europe. To this day, Poland remembers. Not because it wants war, but because it understands what courage can achieve. Now, on the other hand, let's look at Britain. You know, for centuries, we too produced extraordinary men and women. Sailors, soldiers, engineers, explorers, builders and workers. A peasantry of heroes, as Samuel Johnson described them. You know, people who understood duty, sacrifice, responsibility. And today, I sometimes wonder whether we've become so disconnected from our own story, you know, whether we've become so uncomfortable talking about our history that we've forgotten what made us resilient in the first place. And here's something else that I've noticed. Poland has largely decided what it expects of those who live here. Not because every Pole thinks the same, they don't. They argue. They speak to you surly at the ticket office. They disagree. They vote differently. But there remains a strong understanding that citizenship carries responsibilities as well as rights. You know, family matters, community matters. Faith still plays a visible role in many people's lives. You know, national identity isn't automatically viewed as something to be suspicious about. But again, Poland isn't perfect, and no country is. Like Britain, it faces political disagreements, economic pressures, and debates about its future. And this isn't about pretending that one nation has solved every single problem, because they haven't. It's about recognising that nations which remember who they are often find it easier to decide where they're going collectively. And Britain can learn from that, not by becoming Poland, but by asking ourselves the same question. Who are we? Who do we stand for? What do we stand for? What responsibilities come with citizenship to our country? And what kind of country are we trying to build for our families, our children, our grandchildren? Because if we cannot answer those questions, we will continue arguing about immigration, about politics, about economics, without ever addressing the deeper issue. A nation that no longer knows itself cannot expect newcomers to understand it either. You know, perhaps Britain's future doesn't belong with another by-election or another national election. Perhaps it begins by remembering its story. If we do that, we can collectively decide what the next chapter looks like, because a nation that remembers its past is better prepared to defend its future.